All right, well, it is 9:45, and it is the witching hour for our panel. Let's see here. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Government Reform, City Hall Goes Up in Flames panel. This should be a good one. My name is Lisa Gritzner, and I am the past chair of VICA and the CEO for LG Strategies. I will be your moderator today. And I am proud to also be a registration sponsor today. So if you had a wonderful time at registration, I had absolutely nothing to do with it. I would also like to acknowledge our panel sponsor, the wonderful people at California Strategies, represented by Matthew Klink here today. And I'd like to also thank our track sponsors, which are the Los Angeles Police Protective League and Clear Channel Outdoor. The bios of the panelists who are to my right are already in the journal, so we're going to do brief introductions so that we can have more time for your questions. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Dr. Fernando Guerra, Professor of Political Science and Chicano-Latino Studies at Loyola Marymount University. We have Matt Klink, partner at California Strategies. We have Carrie Cavanaugh, the editorial writer for the Los Angeles Times. And we have Rob Kwan, the lead organizer and founder of Unrig LA. So with this esteemed group of folks, we're very excited because I think this is a topic that is top of mind for people, particularly in Los Angeles. As you guys probably are aware, we are no stranger to government corruption, unfortunately, with public officials racking up quite the rap sheet over the past decade. We joke in our business that we know a lot of people that have gone to jail, are in jail, or should be in jail, and that is quite sad, but quite true. In the past year alone, City Hall has been home to at least 2 major scandals. Naturally, other city officials, advocacy groups, and concerned citizens alike are calling for major government reform, including calls to change the city charter and expand the city council. I'm going to give each of these panelists a couple of moments to make an opening statement to get things started, and then I'm going to throw some questions out to all of you and open it up to audience questions as well. So let's get started. Dr. Guerra, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure. Good morning. Thank you, Lisa. Again, Fernando Guerra, Loyola Marymount University. In addition to being a professor, I was the president of the Electoral Reform Commission for the City of LA. That led the movement of elections from the odd years to the even years. I am also currently a member of an academic group studying reform along with several colleagues from USC, UCLA, Cal State Northridge, Pomona College, and I'm missing one, Cal State LA. Collectively, we've been funded by philanthropy to do an extensive study about the type of reforms that we're talking about and work with the City Council. We've been working with the ad hoc committee quite extensively, but we will be making our own recommendations to them and to the communities at large in terms of what we think should be put on there. I would like to just say that I do not believe any of the reforms that we are currently considering would have a direct impact on the scandals that we have seen. None of them are addressing them directly. I do believe collectively that they will change the council and the type of politics that we will see. Rules do make a difference. Just taking a look at the shifting the elections from odd year to even year. We now have very high turnout environments that we didn't have before. And I think it made a difference in who got elected. We saw 3 incumbents lose elections that I don't think, in my opinion, they would have lost had we had the different type of electoral system. I'm talking about David Ryu, Gil Cedillo, and Mitch O'Farrell. They all lost in this new electoral environment. And so I do think it makes a difference. Right now, I think it's a foregone conclusion that we will see in the November ballot a measure to have an independent redistricting commission. There is a consensus from the LA Times, academics, everybody that we should do this. And the council, it will put something on the ballot, and we're all trying to, and that's the game right there. I don't think there's any effort right now. As you all know, 2 ways to put something on the ballot is either through gathering signatures, and that effort is not happening right now. It's almost too late, it's too costly, and so it's up to the city council through the ad hoc committee and through the Rules Committee to put this on the ballot, and I think they will. What it will look like, I think, is up to debate right now, and that's kind of the discussion we can have. Also remind everybody for a quirk, I can give you a 30-minute dissertation of why this is the case, but LAUSD is also in the city charter, and so they currently have a similar commission to the city. It will be a second measure also establishing an independent redistricting commission for the school district. And so you will have those two measures for sure, I think, in November. Then there's discussion about council size and maybe even discussion about school district size, and then ethics reform that's also being discussed in terms of strengthening the ethics commission. The number one issue that I know the academic group is talking about is giving the ethics commission two things specifically. One, the ability for they themselves to put reform directly on the ballot, not through the city council. And number two, for them to control their own budget. And so those two things at minimum, and other things. I'll stop right there in terms of a general introduction, but I am a professor, so I could have taken up the whole hour.
Right, I know. I've seen that happen before.
And that was just in the elevator.
I know. They're just in the hallway outside. Carrie, why don't you give us a brief introduction as well?
Yeah, so I'm Carrie Kavanaugh. I'm an editorial writer at the LA Times. I'm with the opinion side of the newspaper. Yeah, thank you. I'm with the opinion side of the newspaper. I write the unsigned editorials in the paper, and also we do the endorsements that for all the elections. So I've been covering City Hall for about 15 years, first as a reporter, then as an editorial writer. And the things that are being discussed now are a lot of them are issues that have been discussed for years and years. But the confluence of events of, several council members indicted for corruption, the leaked audio scandal, there was just this incredible and unusual public outcry from grassroots groups, but even just average citizens. I mean, at my kid's baseball game, I'm having people talk to me about City Hall corruption. That never happened. So I think there's this moment that there's public interest, public will, and a real opportunity to fix long-standing problems like independent redistricting, like constituent representation through the size of the council, land use reform. Council members have entirely too much power to dictate what gets built in this city. So ethics reform, I mean, even civil service reform. There's a lot of change that can be happened and harnessed in this opportunity. So I think it's really a really unique moment that if our political leaders and community groups and academics really push change, it really has a chance of happening.
Thank you. Matt Klink, you're up next.
Great.
Intro.
Thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everyone. Matt Klink. I'm a partner at California Strategies. One of the few probably up here, lifelong Angelino as well. So I want to jump in the Wayback Machine and take you back to 1996 when Richard Riordan was heading into his second term as the mayor of the city of Los Angeles. And he was frustrated because the system of governance that we have is a strong council, weak mayor system. He was frustrated that as a City Hall outsider at the time, or he positioned himself as such, which is rather ironic, but we can address that later. He was frustrated that the city council was able to thwart his priorities. So he launched something called the Independent Charter Reform Commission. Appointed commissioners, appointed an executive director, one of whom was working with Fernando, Rafe Sonnenschein, on his effort now. And the council, not to be outdone, created the Appointed Charter Reform Commission. So you had two commissions that for 18 months studied potential reforms to the charter. At the time, I was representing a now defunct business group called the Los Angeles Business Advisors. But all of the business community, Central City Association, VICA, the LA Chamber, and LABA joined together. And our mission was simple. It was, one, to keep neighborhood councils from having a formal voting role in the process. And for any of you who know neighborhood councils, it is a goat rodeo watching the neighborhood councils. So they are only advisory. And two, well, actually, that was the only one. And what we did is we threw out what was at the time a red herring, was to increase council size. And we drew maps. We had, I think it was Steve Ely, if I'm not mistaken, drew some maps when he was at Caltech. And that obviously went nowhere. And charter reform, ultimately, the two commissions joined together, compromised, put something on the ballot, and the mayor's powers increased slightly, which the council is always remiss to do, and neighborhood councils were kept advisory. Fast forward to the present, and you have a 6-member ad hoc committee, so meaning that whatever this committee passes, assuming it's unanimous, which it will be, that only 2 more votes are needed. The public has largely no knowledge of what is being considered, and they're, in many cases, grasping at straws. So, increasing council size, we can get, bigger is better is a myth. I don't need to make many, leaps in here, but adding value is important. Adding more members has the potential to dilute it. Better is better. It doesn't mean we need more. We'll get into the specific reasons for that. And the second thing is that, look, the tapes that Carrie discussed, they highlighted what has been an underlying and largely unspoken tension in the city of Los Angeles for a long time. The fight in the city of LA is not white versus black. The fight in the city of LA is black versus brown. You have an African American population that is roughly 10% of the city's population, with 3 of 15 city council seats. You have a Latino population that's 47% or 45%, with 5 council seats. You have the 9th council district that is majority Latino by population and by registered voters, that consistently elects an African American candidate. So when you hear those tapes, and you heard Nuri Martinez and Kevin De Leon and Gil Cedillo talking, they were talking about how you can increase Latino power largely at the expense of the African American population. That's the unspoken truth about the battles that are going on. I mean, we used to joke that, if you look at the Coliseum and the 8th Council District, they don't play with the pointy ball at the Coliseum anymore in Exposition Park. They play with a round ball. The racial and ethnic constituencies that have historically made up Los Angeles are changing, and that is creating some huge problems that are not being adequately dealt with. And we can, look, I'll leave it at that to say we can talk about a lot of other things, but charter reform, be careful what you wish for, you just might get it.
And then finally, opening statement, Rob Kwan.
Thank you, Rob Kwan with Unrig LA, and I grew up in Santa Clarita, which is a lot more like the San Fernando Valley than the rest of the city of LA. Mom's from Kentucky, father's from Trinidad. Grew up in a household where you have to look at things from opposing perspectives. And believe it or not, if you know my politics, it would probably shock you to hear that I grew up, I went to public school. A couple of my sisters went to Chaminade. So we had a long time in the car. And what was on the radio? The John and Ken Show. And it very much fell far to the left of them, but I've always approached politics from wanting to find compromise, wanting to find good solutions. And I'm in the reform area because we can't find compromise or good solutions. We have a corrupted system, and money has a silencing power at City Hall. A lot of the topic right now is corruption. What do we do about that? And I think there's a reality we have to face that in the city of LA, our ethics commission, whatever we give them, they're not the FBI. They're never going to be wiretapping people. They're not going to have the resources to carry out in-depth investigations. And we can't rely on the district attorney or the FBI to enforce the law because, frankly, the Supreme Court has neutered our bribery laws. So you need somebody that's blatantly giving money for favors. That makes it extremely hard to approach corruption from a legal perspective. I think that the reason we've had so many council members get arrested is because they've grown up in a culture where they viewed themselves as untouchable. They didn't have to reconcile with their voters potentially voting them out. That is our fundamental, command. We need to make it easier for people to hold bad politicians accountable. Why is there only one disgraced racist council member on our council right now? Because the other one was voted out. So I think we need to approach things from that perspective. That's what really drove me in 2018 to get into the matching funds reforms. We were looking at those changes to realign our elections and seeing that we would have 3 to 5 times as much turnout. So we wanted to make sure candidates had more money at their disposal to run competitive elections. And since then, we've seen that pay off. I turned to that issue specifically because I saw how LAPD and the LAPPL carried their weight around City Hall and saw that nobody was really willing to speak up to them. And I realized that the only way we could ever get anybody in City Hall to speak up about those issues was to get them speaking about it on the campaign trail. And it's small progress, it's marginal, but we at least have a few people in the room doing that now. So I think that's my big thing, and my reason that I support council expansion is we need to make it a whole lot more competitive on the campaign trail.
I'm curious, Rob, where you think the organized labor falls in this, because you mentioned PPL, but the largest and most influential constituency that doesn't have to register as lobbyists, that has outsized political influence, and that sits on both sides of the bargaining table are the public sector unions that fund and have an oversized influence on council races. But that's missing from what you just said.
I think there are special interests on all sides.
But they're the largest special interest, and you're not talking about them.
Well, we haven't really gotten a chance to talk about anything yet.
If I could just respond really quickly, I've been advocating for the municipal lobbying reforms for years now, and have specifically laid down on that issue because they were trying to pass a watered-down version this year that would exempt public sector unions and unions in general. So that is not something I'm willing to leave off the table.
Good.
In our current law, they are actually covered. Unfortunately, many of them are not good at following the law. So
Right.
That is the dynamic that's at hand.
Well, and I think this is an interesting time to pivot back to Carrie and maybe set the scene a little bit, because we've started to hear a lot of ideas for the reforms that could be coming forward. And I think each person talked a little bit about some of the topics that are being covered, albeit, as Matt pointed out, I think very much under the cloak of night. I mean, when we lived through charter reform the last time, as Matt said, it was 18 months, there was public hearings, there was a lot of discourse and dialogue. And right now, there's been a couple of meetings. I know some of the business groups have been trying to provide input, but there's not been a lot of transparency into this process. So Carrie, my question for you is, we're gonna see a bunch of reform recommendations come forward. What are the changes that you think are gonna be made and when? And, we're hearing things like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think that they're trying to rush things because they want to say, oh, we dealt with corruption, we dealt with reform, we're done. They don't want to dig deep. So I'm curious, should we be fast tracking? Should we be taking our time? What do you think that we should be doing now to make sure that we're not in the same situation 10 years down the line?
Well, I think some things can be fast-tracked. I mean, independent redistricting is such an easy, obvious fix that is near universal agreement. That should be on the ballot as soon as possible. I also think even debates about council size, the particulars of the size still need to be ironed out, but that can be done fairly quickly. I'm a big believer in strike while the iron is hot, because you can always come back to do more. And in fact, the best scenario, in my mind, would be to do some things quickly, like independent redistricting, expand the city council, and then do what Portland, Oregon did, which is they passed a law that there's a charter commission every 10 years. So every 10 years, you're looking at your laws and seeing, well, maybe 18 council members wasn't enough. Maybe we need to go to 23. There's a constant tweaking and adjustment. And as an example of moving fast, and Fernando was on the Electoral Reform Commission that was created after the 2013 election when Mayor Garcetti and Wendy Gruhl, turnout was so embarrassingly low. And so there was a panel that was put together to look about how do we increase voter participation. And they produced a really thorough report about how to change government. And they quickly moved on one, which was changing election dates. And that has been transformative in how elections in the city, the turnout, the types of candidates who are running, the way people are engaged. So that's an example that, move fast on certain things. And then also build in a system where you're constantly evaluating how to make government work better.
I think that's a great idea, actually. Rob, we touched on this earlier, but one of the biggest drivers of corruption is the amount of power that our local politicians have. To address corruption, we have to address who has the power. To what extent do you think those who are in power are going to be both willing to give up power and able to give up power for the greater good? And what do you think the shift in power would actually look like in your ideal world?
They're not, but we're going to have to make them. I think when it comes to reform, the biggest fault line is always really looking discreetly at their power and where it impacts them the most. There's a lot that might not be on the table, but that's what you really have to key in on. And generally speaking, one of the big issues is the power that council members have in land use. And we hear a lot of our council members talking about reforming that. That's been a conversation that's been going on for like 4 or 5 years plus. We hear a lot of candidates saying that we shouldn't have so much discretion. But when it actually comes down to it, and it's in front of them, and it's a project in their district, they definitely want to have a big say over that. And right now, there's one Councilmember Rahman, that I actually think is committed to moving beyond the council fiefdom thing. When I mentioned matching funds reform earlier, and the big issue there was they were trying to double the threshold that you needed to hit to be able to get matching funds. And we pushed back at that, and there was a whole bunch of, we scared the hell out of City Hall because they all realized we're gonna have more challengers running against us, and they're gonna have more money and resources earlier. The only reason we got that was because Jose Huizar's house was raided, a bunch of members were named in an indictment, or a search warrant, and they were all really scared. And we had a lot of committed organizing around that. When it comes to expansion, they are all concerned about when this happens, how big it is, how that affects their power within departments, on committees, and they're all really, really, really scared about having a mayor that's slightly more effective. I think ethics charter reform, you look at San Francisco, their ability to put things, their ethics commission's ability to put things on the ballot, they've had just as many scandals as we have, but they're constantly responding to them. Carrie mentioned periodic charter review. That's something that there has been a motion introduced on that, and I think that's really important so that we're responding to things with a bit of a level head. We're not responding in the midst of crisis, but also, most importantly, so that we have an independent process for amending our charter. So it's not our council members choosing how to regulate themselves.
Thank you. Matt, I'm going to let you talk about the issue that you're itching to talk about, which is, should we expand the city council? They each represent about 270,000 people, and that's the largest, more than any other city in the country. To reduce the number, people are calling to expand the city council, creating a higher number of smaller districts. Should we expand the city council, Matt?
Disbanding the city council?
It's a yes or no.
I know that it is. Well, no, it's not a yes or no, because
not for you, but for most of us.
Because if you're going to expand the system without making some fundamental changes, more doesn't equal more. We want quality. Better candidates yield a better system of governance. The ludicrous notion that if we, instead of 15, if we had 31, thank God we don't get all the government we pay for. I mean, that's the irony in all of this, is that 15 can work just fine, but you want to tinker with the system. Lisa, you and I have had this conversation before. Give the mayor more powers to make decisions. You know, ironically enough, when the city of Los Angeles was founded, we specifically chose a strong council, weak mayor system to fight the corruption that was infecting other East Coast cities and Midwest cities like Chicago, like Cincinnati, like New York. There is never going to be, I mean, look, council members are humans. Human nature is flawed. There will always be problems. San Francisco, which, as you said, has an independent ethics commission, they still have problems. The fact that they can correct it afterward, it still means that the problems are there, and there will be other problems. So the fallacy that we'll get better government by an expanded city council, it just doesn't measure up. You have to also look at, we have the highest paid council members in the nation right now with large staffs. I assume that if we were to expand that number, that no one's going to cut back council salaries and staff proportionately. That's not how government's going to work. It's just tax dollars. It's not their money, it's our money. They're going to throw the more money. I know it's a tiny part of the budget, but in a budget that has a structural budget deficit, $1 million here, $1 million there, now you're talking about something. So, and then those two scariest parts are the last thing you want to do is remove city council members from the discussion over land use projects. What do you want, some unelected city hall bureaucrat making a decision about what gets built in city hall? At least there is a way to hold people accountable if that happens. And an ethics commission with its own budget, where's the check and balance in that? I would rather have the council and the mayor approve the budget and have the ethics committee have some more power. But look, the ethics committee just released something about John Lee that happened 8 years ago. Ironically enough, 6 months before he's on the ballot. Give me a break. They're politicized too. You can't remove politics from politics. It's always going to be there. We can tinker with it, but generally, my belief is more is not better.
Okay,
so
why couldn't you have just started off saying no?
Because then I wouldn't be on a panel if that's
That's a pretty strong no.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Guerra.
Can I ask Matt something real quick?
Oh, sure.
Two things. One, do you think that you could draw fair district maps with 15 puzzle pieces that would please a majority of the city? And, we just had our council members in D.C. meeting with Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Each of our council members represents 2.5 times as many people as he did when he was mayor of South Bend. So if you were a council member, do you think you could respond to the flood of constituent requests you get via phone and email?
Yeah, I do.
So you're just better than all of our council members we have right now?
I don't think Pete Buttigieg is the best example of a transportation secretary. He had no business holding that job, but that's another question entirely. No, look, yeah.
I think our council members have an impossible job.
Redistricting, you're talking about, the software for redistricting has outpaced the concept of redistricting. I have seen that software. And even though they're not supposed to do it, they have a little box up in the left-hand corner, and when you move lines, you move parties of voters, and you can move it very, very sophisticated. So maybe an independent commission is the right way to go about redistricting. But do I think I can make the majority happy? Yeah, I think I could.
All right, Dr. Guerra.
You already had a question, Fernando.
Los Angeles has a tough history with corruption. And it may be helpful for us to talk about some other cities that have been more successful in reining in bad actors and processes. Are you familiar with jurisdictions that have had successful reform efforts? And are we looking at those processes?
Yeah, we are looking and comparing all kinds of different cities. There are two comparisons are the top 10 largest cities in America and then California cities. And of course, you continue to have corruption because the one thing I will agree with Matt is that, at the end of the day, these are all individuals and we're ultimately flawed, and there's corruption in every single type of system that exists. But I would be remiss not to respond strongly to one thing that Matt said in public when he made the statement that this is no longer black and white, but black and brown, and that's the competition. And I would argue that nothing could be further from the truth. Every single year, I conduct the largest general social survey in Los Angeles, where we interview anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 individuals randomly selected. And by the way, we oversample the valley. And so every year we have a survey of the valley compared to the rest of the city and compared to the rest of the county in terms of a variety of different public opinion. In that survey, consistently, blacks and Latinos have a much greater consensus than any other group. And let me just be clear about this. There are no black political districts in Los Angeles. Every single black elected official represents majority Latino communities, and maybe not majority voters, but more than 80% of them represent districts where Latinos are either the majority or the plurality. Latinos overwhelmingly support black elected officials consistently, and in surveys where we give them the option, they continue to do that. They are the least ethnocentric voters in Los Angeles. Whites are the most ethnocentric voters in Los Angeles. And so thank goodness for Latinos, because they're the ones that cut across the aisle consistently in terms of who they support. And so the idea that it's a black-Latino conflict couldn't be further from the truth the way it plays out in the communities that I know, that I study throughout all of Los Angeles. Number two, we have tremendous consensus in Los Angeles. I would argue of all the major cities in America, there is no greater consensus in any other city than in Los Angeles. I'll go further and say there are absolutely no wedge issues in Los Angeles. If you think about the major national wedge issues, they don't exist here. Yes, there are people who are, anti-abortion, but they don't control the narrative, they don't control the politics. Yes, there are people who are anti-immigrant, but they don't control the narrative and they don't control the politics. Yes, there are people who are pro-guns, but they don't control the narrative, they're not the majority. I can go on the whole list. None of the major issues that cut across and divide this nation and divide states exist in Los Angeles. This makes governing Los Angeles so much easier in one respect and difficult in another respect. And so, we do have issues. Homelessness, but it's not a wedge issue because who disagrees with we should solve homelessness? Nobody does, right? Yes, we have another issue, charter schools versus public schools, but it doesn't cut across white, Latino, or black. You find all those different groups and all those different geographies on the different sides. And you can have, other issues that come up. Corruption, we're all against it, right? That's not a wedge issue. Land use, people say, oh, no, it's not a wedge issue. We're all for housing. We're all for less regulation. It becomes a wedge issue in little neighborhoods, right? And so we should celebrate the one tremendous advantage that we have. But now that creates a difficulty then. What are elections about when we have no wedge issues? And you could see it in terms of the way it kind of plays out. So I will say that I am very much in favor of reducing council size. And there's different levels of analysis. I don't disagree with the assumptions and even the arguments that Matt made about the way the council would work. And that I see that as the elite or leadership level analysis in the interactions, that I don't think having 15 and increasing to 30 makes that work better or makes it work less. What I do believe, and I think it goes to his point, is that it will create smaller districts and greater communities of interest, which I think will lead to more engagement. And I could elaborate on that, but I'll stop at that point.
This is the time when we want to hear from folks in the audience. We've had some spirited debates here already, and so Beverly Kenworthy, take us away.
Still to this day, after we've been talking about
I'm going to ask Carrie, because she was the first person who said that you thought we could move quickly on this topic of moving to more council members. I'm curious some of your reactions to some of the concerns that Beverly raised.
Well, I think systemic reform about land use has to be part of this puzzle, and it is to a certain extent. But ultimately, communities need to have a representative that they can go to. And the idea that if you can structure government so you're making citywide policies on housing, on transportation, and that takes less of the individual, and each council member has less individual say over what gets built in their districts, then that becomes less of an issue to a certain extent. But I also just think we have seen the County Board of Supervisors has 5 members. That is not a model of efficient government or effective government. The idea that you have to keep something small in order to depress the sort of negativities of government is a really backwards thinking. And generally speaking, you need to create council districts, that you need more council members and more council districts that better represent the communities, that give people an opportunity to elect somebody who's going to articulate their concerns, and then you develop citywide policies that you're setting the agenda for the city so that individuals are not making specific decisions about what is happening in communities.
I was going to say, Dr. Gary, you talked about communities of interest. Do you want to weigh in on this topic as well?
Yeah, I think the smaller the districts, the better representation of community of interest. I mean, at the end of the day, land use is a lot of the source of the scandal. And, you know, this idea that communities are against housing is just not true. Our surveys over and over show that they are in favor. What happens when a project is proposed, all these NIMBYs come out, and the council member and the planning deputy get scared about that? They don't even consist the majority of that neighborhood, but you never go around to it in a way to ask or counter-mobilize. And the loudmouths get your attention and you respond to them instead of the majority of the people in that very neighborhood. Study after study that I have done shows that to be the case, but the council continued to respond to the loudmouths or the NIMBYs. What does NIMBY stand for? I forgot.
Not in my backyard.
Oh, I thought it stood for not Indian, Mexican, black, or young. I'm sorry.
Good setup there, Fernando.
So I will tell you this couple things. One, we legislate based on who screams the loudest.
That's
whether
right.
at the
Lowest common denominator is how we...
Whether at the federal level or the local level.
Absolutely.
And while I agree with Fernando said about the general population's views on race relations, and his survey work is awesome. If you don't get it, you should read it. Case in point is that tape. What did Nuri Martinez say on the tape about George Gascon? He's with the blacks.
Right.
The politicians want to carve people up based on ethnicity. That's in the context in which I was talking about it. So you're never going to come to a place. I mean, following that logic, we should have, how many neighborhood councils do we have?
Over almost 90?
Well, maybe we should have 91 council seats and have like a mini legislature. I mean, if you're going to increase the number of council seats, give the mayor more power.
I agree with that.
You can't have a weak mayor and have 31 little fiefdoms.
You know what?
Beverly, you're right in what you
just
said.
want to do one more thing about land use. Okay, the population of Los Angeles increased the least in its history between 2010 and 2020. The demographics basically stayed the same, 48% Latino, 48% Latino. As a matter of fact, we now estimate that there are more whites living in LA in 2023 than there were in 2010. There is the end of white flight. Whites are no longer moving out, they're moving back in. There is the end of immigration. Immigrants are still moving in, but nowhere to the degree where they're gonna structure Los Angeles. There's slow growth, okay? It's a completely different city for our first time in our history, okay? We can do better planning. We're gonna have less people. We have permitted much more housing. Economics say, wait a minute, less demand, more supply, prices should be going down. Why aren't they? Because there's an external buyer, hedge funds. 29% of all homes bought in Los Angeles in the last 2 years were bought by corporations. That's where the council should be focusing on. You want housing policy? Look at that and just prevent that, or that's a business. That's not home buying. That's where the council should be. If it took a look at that and changed, made that more difficult, you would create all kinds of immediate housing right now. I mean, it actually already exists. And so the council gets into these small little things without looking at the big policies that could dramatically change the opportunity for Angelenos. There is literally enough housing right now if organized correctly. And we're focused on building more. Yes, we should build more, but the council should prevent these hedge funds with their algorithms and Airbnb and all that. You regulate those and pay attention to that. That would dramatically change.
All right, Rob, you've got the floor now.
I'll be brief just because I want to get to some other questions, but to address the question, I think the execution is really important. It makes no sense to double the size of the council and cut their staff in half. It's also really important to recognize that we have very, very different districts across the board and within the districts. You know, you look at District 15 and Watts being left out. They're attached via the Harbor Gateway and have historically been neglected, always getting drowned out by the louder voices down south. You can look across the board at some of our wealthier districts, and there are communities in those districts that don't get the same kind of services that they should. To the specific question about like having districts that are too small and maybe creating kind of like a polarization. This is something that during the committee discussions, Councilmember Blumenfield described as a balkanization of our council districts. And I don't want to dismiss that potentiality. I would just say that what we're talking about in council right now, what voters will realistically entertain, is in the low to mid 20s. I don't think we're getting to that area where we're coming towards balkanization. I think that would be more in the range of like the mid 30s plus. But I think that you know, the specific numbers that are being discussed right now, we're still going to have districts that are 150,000 people each. Those are really large. So I don't think we have to fear an extreme balkanization via a marginal increase in the council size.
I think, are there any other questions? Yes, go ahead.
So you're all talking about, at some level, about the ratio of voters to districts.
Actually, residents.
It's residents, yeah.
And you're all talking about corruption within the city of LA. Now, aren't there other municipalities in Los Angeles County that have had corruption in much smaller ratios of voters to elected officials? To some degree, I think that what you're talking about is a fallacy in terms of that's going to make a difference.
Totally agree. Yeah.
It's about who's the loudest, not about how many.
No, you're right. My very first statement when I started talking about a long time ago was that these reforms have nothing to do with that. And Kerry then contextualized that the only reason we're talking about this because in that leaked audio tape, it was about redistricting. So we conflated all of that. And it's an easier task to do. And it's very difficult to regulate corruption because you see it from the smallest cities, Vernon, you know, to wealthy cities, to interesting cities like Anaheim. I mean, you know, you can go on and on. In school districts, I mean, there's a corruption happens every single week on some of these things. And it's not inherent to government. Corruption happens more in the private sector, embezzlement, etc. And so the idea that, oh, government is corrupt, no, I would even argue that it's actually less corrupt than the private sector because there's a little bit more regulation and less funds to steal. But anyway.
And if I can...
No punishment, right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
if I could put the point on it, I mean, expanding the city council does not solve corruption. But what it does do is it increases representation. It increases the connection between the resident, the voter, and their council member. And that in turn means that people are potentially paying more attention to what their council member is doing, holding them more accountable, and that is how you address corruption.
Reforms don't have to come with bigger government. And speaking to your point earlier, when Reardon came into office, and I come from a real estate perspective, so he really reformed planning, zoning, municipal services. I mean, it was easier to do deals back then.
Yeah, but how is adding 5 people bigger government?
Look at it today, and from start to finish on a development, and I've done about 10,000 units within the greater LA area. It's 3 to 4 years to pull a permit. It's 3 to 4 years, and you have to hire a lobbyist, a consultant, which, by the way, is usually a retired LA city person. I mean, the amount of hurdles a developer has to go through today is monumental. And
That is wrong. Yeah.
ULA tax, which has really stalled everything. So play ball.
And I think what we're hearing is that the system, regardless of how big the council is or the powers, there are some very fundamental challenges that we have in this city, and it's run on antiquated land use laws. It's run on antiquated views of how services should be delivered, and there is not that leadership and that desire to fundamentally shift the way the government in Los Angeles operates and the way that it delivers services and the way that it has transparency and accountability. And I think, from my perspective, just to throw my thoughts in the ring here, and as a former government official who was a lobbyist,
At the same time?
not anymore. Oh, okay. No, but I'm saying it's sad that people have to hire people like me to try to navigate the system. And there's a lot of us here who do this work for a living, and nothing makes me more sad than some average Joe who can't get their roof replaced on their house because they can't get a permit. And I will help those people just to help them, because I hate the fact that you have to do that. Our government is so complex. It is so Byzantine. It is so small. They play small ball all the time. There's no accountability. And those are the things that I think we need to figure out ways to change, in addition to this idea of how many people are there. 100 people representing this bad system is not going to make it any different or better. So I think that's one thing that I don't hear enough discussion about. Rob?
I think some of those other jurisdictions, you didn't mention any specifically, but there's been a lot of scandal in Southeast LA. Those are areas that are in kind of a media desert, where they don't get nearly as much attention as we do at City Hall, and there's not nearly as much civic engagement. So I think City Hall is a different beast. And generally speaking, I think beyond making it easier to remove a bad or unresponsive council member, we have to look at the council presidency. We didn't just see power in a raw form in those tapes. It was about the council president's power to threaten members, trying to keep a stranglehold on their power. That is what was going on. So by having more council members, that council president's job is a little bit less secure, and I don't think we're going to see people wielding that position in the same way. Could be wrong, but I also think, generally speaking, what we need in council is a greater diversity of voices, and that's not just for people espousing my positions. You can look at CD 12. Personally, I don't think we're going to have John Lee there in a year plus. Could be wrong, but I as much as I like the person who got in the race against him just now, I think having conservative voices on the council is really important, because the thing I fear the most is our government just continues to flounder, and the next conversation is one about secession. And interestingly, during the redistricting process, I heard a couple times somebody calling in from the Valley saying, hey, we need to also expand the council, and if you don't, we might as well just secede. So I want to see the city stay together.
Lisa has some interesting thoughts on that.
I was going to say, we can talk about secession all day long, but that wasn't going to solve the problem either, because it was just going to create the second largest dysfunctional city in California. So, but smaller cities maybe. I'm getting some text messages from the audience, so I'm going to go ahead and use that as an opportunity to ask some of these questions. I'm getting asked about, to lean in a little bit more on the union issue. We heard a little bit of discussion about the police union and then the public sector unions. What role do these folks play in the delivery of service, in the provision of government, and in the politics in our city.
They're-
Anyone want to take it?
They are unquestionably the most powerful special interest group in the city of Los Angeles, hands down, bar none. The PPL has influence on really one issue, anything to do with police. But there are other issues about support for tax increases, about provisions in law that require union membership, prevailing wage, all of the things that drive up the costs. More benefits for union members, higher salaries for union members, et cetera, et cetera. And the union members have elected the members of the city council with campaign dollars from their members. And then they turn around and lobby those same members. I mean, yes, it's the equivalent of a city council member becoming a lobbyist, except put it on steroids.
I don't disagree with what you said, but let me also point out that Angelenos, residents and voters, overwhelmingly support unions and everything that unions are asking for.
I don't disagree with that.
So that if you didn't have the unions lobbying and getting it done, and you put it to a referendum, they would not only win everything that they're asking for, they would win even more.
Maybe,
No, they
maybe
would.
not.
The polling is overwhelming. Look, any time you ask people,
ULA aside, though, I've done very well beating union-authored measures.
but that's a different thing.
But that's the ballot, Fernando.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the general support. You're right about sometimes
I don't
voters and
argue
how
with you
we
on
can
that.
manipulate that. The reason the unions are the most significant and important players in City Hall is because they're focused, that's their issue, it's economics for them, and they have the general support of Angelenos.
And then
that
we should
gives
regulate them.
I-
We should more heavily regulate them so we know what they're doing. That's all I was saying.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So, I don't mind concentration of power. What I mind is lack of transparency.
That's a
But
great
that's
point.
not my question. My question is, you have a changing population, so I represent the Realtor Association and we get surveys. Los Angeles is moving into a renter-occupied majority from homeowner majority. How does that affect local government and what needs to be done to provide services? Because now you've got the owners diminishing as far as their voice is concerned, but you've got renters who have no stake in terms of taxes being imposed, or which are parcel taxes and others. How does this whole equation work?
Yeah, I would debate your last assumption that they have no stake on taxes, because they ultimately pay all the taxes through their rent. So, but, yeah. So there is a clear distinction in terms of how renter and homeowners think. Again, self-interested. Look at our surveys. We have that variable, and we can cut every single question about homeowners and renters, right? And it is the homeowner or let me put it this way, it's the property owner class who by their actions are creating more renters, okay, in terms of the cost, et cetera. I don't want to get into more detail, but in generic terms, not individual actions, but generically, the property owner class of Los Angeles is just what's creating the environment that's creating more homeowners. And they're like, oh my God, creating more renters. We're creating more renters that are kind of anti-property, but your own actions are what's leading to that. And so there's got to, you are absolutely right. That, I think, is the biggest wedge issue that exists in Los Angeles between renters and homeowners. It's clear in all the surveys.
Dr. Guerra, I'm not sure what you mean by how the property owners are creating the rental class. Can you?
Sure. Okay,
expand that?
because we have to constantly be turnover. You want to collect property and then you want to sell it, and then you have to sell it at the high price, which is capitalism. But then that creates higher rents, and we continue to churn that. I mean, we can go throughout the whole idea of owning property and developing property to make a profit. It makes it more, and you got to sell at one point. And the fact that you have hedge funds that then sometimes can only hold this for 5 years and they have to sell. I mean, we can't cover the whole thing, but it is clear to me that the collective action of property owners is what drives the housing market in Los Angeles. Okay. I totally agree with you. That's a cost. Yeah.
No rent increases for 3 years, with utility rates that have gone up 30%, trash, talk about corruption.
Yeah.
Recycling trash is
Yeah, yeah. That's absolutely.
and you can't pass it on to tenants.
Right.
And you're saying landlords? Dude, your surveys are
No.
All
The
right.
surveys didn't say.
The
Listen,
surveys reflect the view of the people
that's
surveyed.
right. That's right.
Well, and
You
I,
mean-
I think we can agree that there's a lot of question about the amount of regulation that we do have in the city of Los Angeles. And I think, again, this idea of needing to really evaluate what services our government should be providing, how we are allowing, commerce to happen and all these other things. When are we going to be able to get to this conversation? We talked earlier about this, the city is moving quickly to try to change some of these things that we think probably could happen, and that maybe we could have a charter reform commission that exists past, each time when we're going to make changes. Who's going to sit down and really think about and rethink our government structure? Who's going to do that? How does that happen? How do we get to some of these questions?
I think Fernando's, the group that you're a part of with the academics, there's the academic perspective, which I think provides the foundation, and then the people that are actually involved in the politics need to get involved, because there's the book learning side of it, and then there's the real world. But the first study that Fernando's group put out is phenomenal. You want a good education on charter reform and laying out the case for reform, you should read that study. Another good study is the Central City Association. I know I'm probably not supposed to say that at VICA, but the Central City Association has about a 30-page document that lists out historically what has been done and council size. So there is a lot of research there. The problem, though, with charter reform in general, Lisa, and I think what you're getting at is it's sporadic, so that they can pass charter reform and say, okay, we've done that, what's next? And it needs to be, Rob, what you said, I do think there needs to be something that people are continually looking at this, what's working and what's not. That's just not how government works. Government solves the problem that screams the loudest or that itches the most. They don't deal with long-term policy changes.
Any other questions from the audience today?
By the way, we didn't even talk about LAUSD.
We don't got that kind of time.
Collective sigh.
Yes, sir. Go ahead, Rob.
I know this is an issue that's come up in some of Mayor Bass's discussions with neighborhood council members. There's a lot of simmering frustration. We've had this experiment for 20 years, and I think there's some good things we can glean from it. We're also seeing a lot of neighborhood councils unable to conduct elections in the last time around because they didn't have enough candidates. I think there's a limit to how much we might want to have a number of neighborhood councils, you know, that we are kind of getting into that balkanization thing. I think the local voice is important. I don't know how much I want to dig that in, but I do think that we need to make neighborhood councils worthwhile for people to participate, because most people don't sit on them for 14, 15 years. They do one term and they're like, I'm being yelled at about liquor permits and a development and treated like an elected official. And I got Wayne Spindler trolling me just like the elected officials with a goat puppet, and I'm not even being paid for this thing. So I think one thing we might want to do is just give them a more substantive voice. I think a big thing we need to change is the dialogue at City Hall, and even if it's just a monthly meeting where our neighborhood councils have a congress that they can assemble, where they actually come up with an agenda, monthly meetings, and they can take pro-con positions and have an exchange with our council members, so that maybe it's just the council presidents from those neighborhood councils representing at that meeting. But I think we need to give our neighborhood councils members more reason to hang in there, because we have a lot of brain drain with the turnover on neighborhood councils. I don't know about really digging them in deeper into the planning process than they already are, but I do think we need to look at that, and that's something that I hope if we do a charter commission, that's something that we look at down the line.
Neighborhood councils have as much power as they deserve. They should be advisory only.
Just one angle is that if you give them more power in decision making, you could end up with having civil rights lawsuits, because the way neighborhood councils are currently constituted, they're not of equal size. They're not, you can have anybody vote that has a stake even though they're not residents and all of that. Those are all violations of the Voting Rights Act. And so that if you use that system of government to make formal decisions, they have to be able to fit into that, which they currently do not, and you would have to completely revise them.
That's a really good point. Beverly?
I just have one last observation. You know, having worked in the council office for a number of years, I really do like this idea of a council member being more responsive to their constituents. I think we have a lot of council members who are focused on things bigger than what city council officers are supposed to be doing, which is responding to their constituents and then quality of life issues. When you work in a council office, your phone calls every day are, I'd like my street repaved, we have a pothole, our street lights are out, our trees need to be trimmed, we need a stop sign here, we're having traffic safety issues. But historically, the council as a whole underfunds these departments that provide these services. And it makes me, I still don't understand that. Because it is the majority of the calls. And we're constantly saying, no, we don't have it. They're like, oh, you're just saying that. There's nothing more than I would like to do. Say, yes, we can get your street repaved. Who wants to say no? Oh, we have to put you on a waiting list. That is the fundamental responsibility. But we have council members who are running on environmental issues, which are important. But what can they really do here in the city of LA? And I think we've gotten really far away from that. And the homeless issue has created a lot of frustration and quality of life issues for constituents. And I would really like to see, again, some of this stuff that could be given more attention to, and to be more responsive. And
But what prevents a council member from doing that right now?
the lack of funding. Yeah, well, lack of funding. They don't, I don't know why they don't see that during the budget committee. Why they are not funding street services.
Because nobody's re-evaluating. The system is so big, right? And there's so many little departments and fiefdoms and all these things. The systems are so big. Nobody just says, and they tried it with the zero-based budgeting, right? I think it was the Hahn administration. They were like, we're starting from scratch. And then all these little special interests and fiefdoms within the city came back and they were like, you can't cut me. Even if it's a project or something that's barely serving anybody, right? It would have gone so much further to be able to trim more trees, fill more potholes, repave more streets. But instead they have, you know, a million different programs for a million different things, and they're wasting money, and nobody is saying, let's reevaluate from the bottom up as to whether or not we need all these programs and all these things, and what is it that we really are supposed to be focused on. And I think,
Hey, I do want to make two very broad points. Number one, everybody in here is very much engaged, and we all know about the audio leaks, et cetera. In our survey, 43% of LA residents were not familiar with it, okay? So that means 57% still were. That's pretty high for any civic issue, right? Number one. And then number two, I would point to that only 13% turnout in the district to re-elect. So the idea that everybody was mobilized and everybody was angry about it, only 13%. Yeah, so that's number one. That sometimes we get stuck in a bubble and we talk about things, and sometimes that's not resonating or mobilizing or influence people out there, okay? Number two, of all the major cities in America, Angelenos are the most optimistic about their communities and their government, okay? We believe more than any other major city that we are going in the right direction. It is a question we ask every single time. Is the city going in the right direction? It is asked everywhere. Every pollster asks that question first. And so we have comparisons from across the United States, across the cities, across everything. We rank the highest. So as much as we are kind of complaining here and being negative, Angelenos are the most optimistic major urban dwellers in America. I just want you to remember that.
well, and we will end on that happy note. I'd like to take a few moments to thank, first of all, our panelists today. I thought this was a really spirited and good discussion, and clearly some really smart people are thinking about these big questions and these big issues. I have some things I'm supposed to say, so let's go here. I'd like to thank our track sponsors, the Los Angeles Police Protective League, which has entirely too much power, we learned earlier today, according to Rob, and our panel sponsor, the California Strategies team. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you for spending the morning with us today. The next round of panels begin at 11:15. So in the meantime, please don't hesitate to visit the exhibitors, and make sure you return your VICA bingo card to the registration table to win a Southwest round-trip tickets on Southwest, possibly a signed football from the LA Rams, jewelry from Kendra Scott, and a staycation at the Garland. So thank you guys so much for being here today.